Prince George walked into Buckingham Palace a boy, but he walked out as something else entirely. That single afternoon, May 5th, 2025, will be remembered not for its pageantry, but for the silent transformation that took place within the palace walls. On the surface, it was just another royal engagement, a tea reception honoring World War II veterans on the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Yet, for William and Catherine, it was the moment their son quietly stepped across a line they had hoped he wouldn't cross so soon. A line between innocence and duty, between boyhood and the burden of the crown. Dressed in his modest school uniform turned ceremonial attire, George appeared calm. He sat beside his father, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. He listened. He nodded. He asked questions that startled even the most seasoned veterans. His eyes held the weight of understanding far beyond his years. He shook hands not with the awkward hesitation of a child, but with the grace of a boy raised under the shadow of a 1,000-year-old institution. And while the cameras clicked and the world watched, something shifted. The public saw a royal heir, but behind the smiles, his parents saw something else entirely. William and Catherine stood proud, but also visibly shaken. The look in Catherine's eyes was not just maternal pride. It was a flicker of fear, a silent ache only a mother could understand. Watching her son engage with men who had stared death in the face, hearing him ask about Normandy, submarines, and the horrors of war, these were not moments she had imagined for her 11-year-old. And yet, here he was, standing in the same place where generations of monarchs had stood before him, fulfilling a role he didn't choose, but was born into. With every handshake, every exchange, a little more of his childhood slipped away. For William, the moment was equally heavy. The father, who once promised to shield his children from the crushing weight of royalty, now stood silently beside his son, allowing that very weight to rest on his small shoulders. George didn't flinch. He didn't falter. He mirrored his father's composure, his posture, even his subtle nods of respect. It was as if the crown had already begun shaping him slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. The transformation wasn't announced. There was no trumpet, no headline screaming of a new chapter. But those who truly watched, who truly listened, knew something had changed. The monarchy hadn't spoken, but it had whispered, and the world had heard. In that moment, Prince George didn't just attend a royal engagement, he entered history. He became part of something far larger than himself, and his parents, caught between pride and heartbreak, stood witness to a destiny that was no longer a distant future, but an unfolding present. But behind the palace gates, a silent storm was brewing, one that would expose the emotional weight carried by two modern parents raising a future king. As George rose before the world, poised and composed in the shadow of Buckingham Palace, Catherine stood silently in the background, watching, smiling, and quietly unraveling what the cameras didn't see. That day was a mother holding her breath, torn between duty and the primal instinct to protect her child. Because as George stepped further into the spotlight, Catherine began slipping deeper into a private struggle, one shaped not just by history, but by the looming weight of the crown's future. Sources close to the palace revealed that Catherine had long been preparing for this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. According to royal biographer Ingrid Seward, Catherine is obsessed with ensuring that her children, especially George, are ready not just to inherit a throne, but to survive it. She knows the cost. She's seen it in her husband's haunted expressions, in the silent grief that still clings to every mention of Princess Diana. And now, in her own reflection, weakened by illness and worry, she sees just how high the stakes truly are. Her recent health crisis changed everything. What was once a distant concern became an urgent mission. The illness shook her not just physically, but spiritually. It forced her to reevaluate everything: her role as a mother, as a royal, as a protector. Catherine, ever composed before the world, was suddenly battling from behind the scenes. Her vulnerability only strengthened her resolve to shape her children's emotional world with care, grounding them in love before the expectations of royalty swallowed them whole. She wasn't just raising children, she was sculpting future monarchs. And she knew time was no longer on her side. George's public transformation at age 11 rattled something inside her. It wasn't just that he was growing, it was how quickly the palace was pulling him forward. Just yesterday, he was baking cookies and kicking footballs in the garden. Today, he's bowing to veterans and asking questions about war. Catherine knew this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon, and certainly not while she was still regaining her own strength. Seeing George step into his future, while she was still recovering from her darkest nights, only deepened the emotional storm brewing within her. Yet, Catherine has never been one to fold under pressure. Her upbringing, rooted in Middleton family values of kindness, humility, and presence, prepared her for something palace life never could: emotional intelligence. She brought something new into the royal bloodline, something modern and compassionate. She holds her children when they cry, kneels down to their level when they speak, and teaches them that their titles mean nothing if their hearts are empty. It's this balance of normalcy and nobility that defines her parenting. Together, she and William have committed to giving George, Charlotte, and Louis a life that blends the crown with childhood, never allowing one to eclipse the other. Still, for all her planning, all her instincts, nothing could brace her for what George would become, not someday, but now. Because George's transformation wasn't announced in headlines or etched into a royal decree. It was spoken in his silence, his posture, his poise, and Catherine felt it. Not as a princess, but as a mother. And in that unspoken moment, she realized something heartbreaking. Her child wasn't just growing up. He was stepping into a destiny neither of them could control. Yet no amount of careful parenting could prepare them for what George would reveal next. Not in words, but in presence. Among war heroes, an 11-year-old prince stood tall, and everyone felt it. The crowd gathered for the 80th anniversary of VE Day had come to honor the past. But what they witnessed was a glimpse of the future. Prince George, standing shoulder to shoulder with legends who had once stormed beaches and battled tyranny, wasn't just a child playing a ceremonial role. He was stepping into history not as a spectator, but as a participant. And in that quiet, surreal moment, the world saw more than a royal child. It saw a monarch in the making. The setting couldn't have been more symbolic. Veterans Day at Buckingham Palace wasn't just about remembrance, it was about legacy. It was about passing down stories, values, and the burden of memory to those who would carry it forward. When Prince George walked into that gathering, he did so under the shadow of giants men and women who had shaped the course of the 20th century with their courage. Yet instead of shrinking in their presence, George leaned in. He listened. He asked questions. And he honored them with something far rarer than formality. He honored them with presence. His interaction with Alfred Littlefield, a 101-year-old veteran of D-Day, became the moment that changed everything. The two locked eyes, and George didn't flinch. "What was it like when you were coming in?" he asked, voice steady. Littlefield, taken aback by the depth of the question, replied simply, "Pretty awful." But in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them. It was more than curiosity. It was respect. And perhaps more tellingly, it was understanding. George wasn't just mimicking diplomacy. He was absorbing wisdom, letting it shape him. The look on Littlefield's face afterward said it all he saw. Not a boy, but a future king worthy of the title. Dougie Hyde, another veteran at the event, shared a similar experience. George had asked him, "Did you ever get fired at? Did you ever see a U-boat?" It wasn't the question itself, but the way it was asked, earnest, engaged, alive with genuine interest. Hyde later told reporters he was very impressed with the lad, calling him polite and insightful. These weren't just throwaway compliments. These were the words of men who had seen life and death up close, who could instantly sense whether someone was real or rehearsed. And to them, George was undeniably real. Throughout the afternoon, photographers caught fleeting but powerful glimpses. George leaning in as veterans spoke, nodding slowly, hands clasped in stillness. A boy listening to stories soaked in blood and bravery, never looking away. Not once did he fidget. Not once did he seem distracted. He carried himself with the calm resolve of someone twice his age, and yet not a hint of arrogance colored his demeanor. That balance between curiosity and composure left a lasting impression. It was no longer a matter of if he would be king, but what kind of king he might become. Even the veterans who had once been greeted by Queen Elizabeth herself felt the shift. As they stood beside George, some whispered that they had never seen a royal child so attuned, so respectful, so emotionally present. And as the event drew to a close, the whispers grew louder. A quiet realization spread through the palace halls, and across the grounds, George had crossed a threshold. The boy who entered Buckingham that morning was not the same one who left. Something inside him had awakened. But even as George impressed strangers, his transformation was quietly shaking the foundation of royal parenting behind closed doors. Catherine always dreamed George would be normal. The crown had other plans. From the very beginning, she vowed that her children would grow up with muddy hands and scraped knees, not velvet gloves and rigid postures. She imagined bedtime stories, forest walks, laughter in the kitchen, not cold palace corridors, and centuries of expectation. But no dream, no matter how deeply held, could completely hold off the pull of destiny. And as George took on his earliest, royal duties, that dream began to fracture. The balance between royalty and reality had never been more fragile. William and Kate understood the burden better than anyone. They'd lived it. They'd watched the toll it took on previous generations. Children raised in golden cages, robbed of emotional depth in the name of decorum. They were determined to break the cycle. So they made a plan, not just for their reign, but for their family. It was simple. Raise George as a child first, a royal second. And for years, it worked. He baked cookies in the kitchen, hiked through the Scottish Highlands, and played football with friends after school. On weekdays, he blended into classrooms like any other student. But on state occasions, the transformation came. The school uniform gave way to tailored suits. The crown didn't sit on his head, but its weight was there in his walk, in his posture, in the knowing look he shared with his father. It was deliberate, calculated even. William and Kate rejected the old model, the one that raised heirs through nannies, protocols, and formality. They brought their children close. No delegation, no distance. When George had questions about the world, they answered them not with royal scripts, but with honesty. When he cried, they didn't hide it or hush it. They comforted him. They didn't prepare him to be a symbol. They raised him to be a man. Inside their home, normalcy was not a performance. It was the rule. Dinner was shared. Bedtime stories were read aloud. School projects were proudly displayed on the fridge. George, Charlotte, and Louis were treated not like future monarchs, but like children who deserved a chance to be just that. Kate joined school runs. William volunteered at sporting events. They weren't trying to create perfection. They were trying to create resilience. Psychologists and child development experts praised the couple's approach. In a world where pressure could turn even the strongest minds brittle, grounding George in a sense of belonging. And emotional safety was not just wise, it was essential. Experts called it revolutionary for the royal family. But even as praise poured in, an uncomfortable truth began to settle in. Normality can only go so far when your destiny is anything but. Because while William and Catherine fought to protect their son's innocence, the institution had already begun shaping him quietly, systematically. Behind every poised royal child, there's a silent teacher in the shadows. While the world applauds Prince George's calm demeanor and polished presence, very few know the quiet forces shaping him behind palace walls. Forces that don't wear crowns but carry decades of experience. In this royal machine, image isn't left to chance. And when it came time to refine George's transformation from child to heir, it wasn't William or Catherine who stepped in first, it was Princess Anne. The Princess Royal, the monarchy's most disciplined figure, had been preparing for this moment long before George took his place at public events. Her mentorship began not with George, but with Charlotte. The younger princess, curious and spirited, became Anne's first student in what palace insiders have dubbed Royal Boot Camp. It was Anne who taught her how to curtsy correctly, how to walk with purpose, and most importantly, how to carry herself with quiet strength. But as George's public responsibilities began to intensify, Anne redirected her focus. The future king needed a foundation, and she was determined to build it. Anne's lessons are not dramatic. They don't come with speeches or ceremonies. They arrive in small, critical moments before a balcony appearance, after a church service, during a family gathering when no press is watching. It's in those spaces where Anne corrects a handshake, adjusts posture, and coaches on eye contact. She teaches more than just tradition. She teaches control, emotional control, the kind a monarch must have when standing before the world during crisis. And George, despite his age, is absorbing it all. But Anne wasn't alone. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, stepped in with a different kind of guidance. Where Anne offered discipline, Sophie offered relatability. As a working royal who raised children while navigating duty, Sophie became an essential presence behind the scenes. She knew what it meant to shield her kids from the scrutiny of royal life while still preparing them for it. With George, she didn't teach him how to walk like a prince. She taught him how to connect with people like one, how to speak gently, listen fully, and build trust with strangers through grace rather than status. Together, Anne and Sophie have created something rare. A mentorship rooted not in privilege, but in service. They don't train for appearances. They train for substance. They understand that George can't just look royal, he must embody it. Every nod, every handshake, every moment of silence carries weight. And that weight must be handled with care. Through them, George is learning to wear the crown long before it ever touches his head. But what's most striking is how invisible their work remains. The public may never see it. They might never know that the way George bowed before a veteran or held a conversation with humility came from hours of quiet coaching by two women who've seen the cost of royalty up close. Their influence isn't splashed across headlines, it's sown into George's every public step. He doesn't just appear ready, he's being shaped to be ready. And so, as George stepped into the shoes of history, he was stepping into something much larger than himself, a moment carefully staged to echo the past. The balcony had seen kings and queens. That day, it saw a future. 80 years had passed since Victory in Europe Day first brought the royal family to those same stone railings, standing in solemn celebration above a world forever changed. In 1945, it was King George VI and a young Elizabeth who waved to seize, of faces still raw with grief, but full of hope. In 2023, Charles stood there as a newly crowned monarch, flanked by tradition. But now, in 2025, it wasn't the old guard who commanded the moment, it was Prince George. There were no living royals left who had stood on that balcony during the original VE Day. The past had become history, and history had become memory. And memory, in the House of Windsor, is sacred currency. George wasn't just attending an event, he was embodying continuity. Surrounded by veterans whose lives had been defined by sacrifice, the 11-year-old heir took his place where his great-great-grandfather once stood, not with pomp or fanfare, but with an eerie calm. And in that stillness, the weight of what he represented fell upon everyone watching. The echoes of history were unmistakable. The Royal Air Force tore through the skies above Buckingham in tight formation, just as it had done generations ago. Uniformed veterans, now hunched with age, stood in reverent silence. George stood among them, dressed not as a child, but as an apprentice to the throne. He didn't flinch, he didn't fidget. He watched, he listened. And when he looked out at the crowd, he did so with the gaze of someone who understood, maybe for the first time, that his name is more than just his own. It is a symbol, a promise. Every detail of the ceremony had been meticulously chosen to echo the past. The outfits, the balcony formation, even the timing of the flyovers, it was all by design. But what couldn't be staged was George's presence. He wasn't performing, he was absorbing. As the cameras zoomed in, the resemblance between eras was almost unsettling. It was as if time had looped back on itself, placing a boy in the footsteps of ghosts. The tradition he now participated in wasn't about royalty. It was about survival of memory, of sacrifice, of a nation that had endured far more than pageantry. This was not a photo opportunity. This was a legacy handoff in plain sight. George wasn't there because he had to be. He was there because the institution needed the world to see the future. And in that carefully constructed silence, in that balcony's historical shadow, something unspoken passed from the veterans to the boy. A torch, a burden, a truth. The child they once protected would now protect their memory. And as the crowd cheered, a new question emerged online. Was this transformation inspiring or heartbreaking? Some saw a leader in the making. Others saw a child being taken too soon. The image of Prince George standing beside war veterans, asking questions with depth and grace, sent shockwaves across the nation and beyond. But as the applause faded and the headlines shifted, a far more complex reaction began to rise. Social media lit up with debate. For every post praising his maturity, another cried out in concern. And at the center of it all stood an 11-year-old boy caught between admiration and apprehension, between legacy and innocence. Many felt inspired, moved by the quiet strength George displayed at the VE Day ceremony. They saw in him a reflection of his great-grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch who understood duty from the moment she could speak. Supporters of the royal family praised William and Catherine for preparing their son so thoughtfully, so intentionally. They called it foresight. They called it honor. After all, how else does one raise a future king? For those in favor, George's public appearance was not exploitation. It was education, but not everyone agreed. A growing chorus of voices, especially online, challenged the decision to place George in such a public, emotionally charged role at such a young age. Some called it performative. Others called it cruel. One viral comment read, "What happened to giving royal children a normal life?" Another echoed the fears of many. That boy looked composed, yes, but he also looked like he was carrying the world. The criticism wasn't just directed at the institution. It was personal. It pointed at William and Catherine, and it stung. Psychologists soon entered the conversation, not with judgment, but with insight. They acknowledged the emotional risks of early exposure to public life, but they also highlighted the benefits when done thoughtfully. According to child development experts, experiences like George's, when guided and balanced, can actually foster emotional intelligence. They teach empathy, history, perspective. And when paired with love and support at home, these moments don't break children. They shape them. The key, they said, was intention. And by all appearances, the Prince and Princess of Wales had been intentional from the start. Indeed, the Wales's parenting style has been praised by modern monarchists and mental health advocates alike. They've brought their children close rather than keeping them behind palace walls. They've shown the public a different kind of royal upbringing, one rooted in emotional presence, not distant tradition. George isn't being raised to serve a crown. He's being raised to lead with character. And for many, that difference matters. Still, the debate refuses to die down. Because beneath the praise, beneath the criticism, lies a deeper unease. Not just about George, but about what he represents, a monarchy trying to evolve without losing itself. The pressure he carries is not just royal, it's national, it's generational, and it's growing. But beneath the surface, experts knew what this really meant for George, for the monarchy, and for Britain's future. He's not just growing up, he's growing into the crown. And he's doing it with eyes wide open. Behind the formality of titles and ceremonies, a quiet revolution is taking place, one that reshapes what it means to raise a king. Prince George, at only 11, is being sculpted not through power, but through principle. The palace isn't forcing a crown onto his head. Instead, it's being placed gently into his understanding, one conversation at a time. And unlike the generations before him, George isn't being trained to obey tradition. He's being taught to lead it. Experts have started to take notice. What makes George's journey unique isn't the pressure, it's the absence of it. Behind the curtain, his growth is being guided by love, not command. Discussions about homelessness aren't hypothetical, they're real, age-appropriate dialogues about compassion and responsibility. War isn't glorified, it's explained. And leadership isn't assumed, it's modeled. In the Wales household, duty doesn't begin with expectation. It begins with empathy. And that single shift is what may change the monarchy forever. According to royal historian Robert Lacey, George's roadmap was laid out with care. He was just 7 years old when William and Catherine chose the moment to tell him the truth, that one day he would wear the crown. But even that conversation wasn't a lecture. It was a turning point, disguised as a simple talk. One designed to protect, not overwhelm. Since then, George's world has slowly expanded, with each year building upon the last. He's not being dragged into destiny. He's walking into it step by step, heart first. This approach has allowed something extraordinary to happen. George is evolving as both a child and a leader. He still laughs, still plays, still learns like any other boy his age. But woven into that innocence is a deepening sense of purpose. He's not told to lead. He's shown how. Through his parents' kindness, through his mentors' guidance, through moments of silence, reflection, and public service that whisper what it truly means to serve. And now, as the monarchy shifts around him with elder royals slowly retreating from the public stage, George is stepping forward. Not with arrogance, not with haste, but with an emerging strength that is impossible to ignore. His presence at public events no longer feels ceremonial. It feels inevitable. And through it all, William and Catherine remain beside him, not just as parents, but as protectors of his becoming. For William and Catherine, the tears weren't just about pride. They were for a childhood quietly fading and a crown drawing near. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.